I guess my first question is, as the chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, gender-based employment issues must come up quite often in the course of the work that you do. As far as the entertainment industry is concerned, do you see that what's happening there? Do you see that a lot in other professions?
So I think there are some really challenging questions around gendered employment practices. And we know that it's tougher in the workplace if you're a woman. The recent inquiry we just did about COVID and the gendered economic impact, beautifully reinforced by the Office for National Statistics, showed that the pandemic has been tougher for women. But historically, we also know that there are real challenges around women in the workplace, particularly women who've taken a career break, maybe to shock horror, bring up their family or with other caring responsibilities, that it can be much harder for them to get back into the workplace. When I was at the Cabinet Office, we were pioneering some work about returnships and ways that you could make that transition easier. But the reality is that what we see in the entertainment industry, I think in very stark relief, is that men in their 50s will be seen as in the prime of their career, and women in their 50s quietly sidelined, taken off screen. And it's just not acceptable. And to me, quite astonishing that that still carries on.
Do you think there's a single root cause as to why this gendered ageism? Because that's the way that I always describe it, because as you quite rightly point out, it's not a fact of life for men. Do you think there's a single root cause, or can we identify perhaps what drives it?
So I don't think there's a single cause. I think there are a lot of issues and structures in place that all conspire to build up to discrimination against women. So first and foremost, when you look at production teams, when you look at senior management, the people who are making the decisions, very heavily skewed towards men. I also think there are some really outdated stereotypes and lazy stereotypes that women in their coming up to 30, you're young, you're dynamic, you're youthful, you're beautiful, and then suddenly we become I joke, but hideous old hags. Oh, you can't use they're too old, they're too mature, too lined, too grey, too whatever. And I just think that at the root cause, if I had to point to one thing, I'd say it's basic misogyny. And it's basically the patriarchy dictating and determining what sort of woman is acceptable to us. Good grief, how shocking is that?
Yeah, it's what I refer to within the campaigning as this perceived sexual currency of youth. As well as that, within the industry, and I think more widely in society, we're seeing a lot of almost what I refer to as normalization of cosmetic procedures, chemical modifications of women's faces. And there's a whole argument to be had around personal choice and personal preference and how women use their disposable income. For me, around my campaigning, it arises from conversations that I've had with many older actresses about the fact that this is deemed to be an employment requirement. It seems so strange, again, to think that this is a requirement of employment, and something that I don't think we would see in other areas. What is your take on that?
Well, and I think to a certain extent, we're culpable in it. So it doesn't have to be cosmetic procedures, can it? It can just be something as straightforward as dyeing your hair grey is not accepted, and is a demonstration of the ageing process. But I think we really have to boil this down to it's got to be about personal choice. You shouldn't be expected to look a certain way for any job. I would have thought for actors that actually cosmetic procedures, changing the way your face looks, losing some of that expression is a bad thing. And I think it's really interesting that it becomes an industry norm that the women will fight off the aging process tooth and nail, and men will simply become silver foxes. And it's just, it goes back to what I said, this is gender stereotypes at their worst, this is ageism at its worst. And I think our whole view of aging has changed enormously. And she won't thank me for saying this, but I can remember my mother's 40th birthday and thinking that she was old. Now, obviously, I was a child at the time, and everybody over 20 seems old to you. But the reality is that my 50th birthday is approaching, and I don't regard myself as old in any shape or form. I am absolutely in the prime of my life. And I think how absolutely ludicrous that, particularly in the entertainment industry, women of my age would be regarded as past it, not usable anymore, whereas men carry on working into their 50s, 60s, 70s. You know, you get the exceptions in their 80s, don't you?
Yeah, you absolutely do, and directors as well. So, and the campaign sort of encompasses presenters, the comedy world, as well as actors. And I think one of the difficulties for me is that we are so, and young women particularly now, are so fierce about bodily autonomy and facial autonomy. And yet this bleeding through of chemically modifying women's faces is actually being picked up by younger and younger women. I read somewhere recently that women as young as 14 are terrified of aging and are seeking, not necessarily attaining, but seeking Botox. And so I think a rejection of an aging woman's face particularly, but a rejection and almost a fear of aging seems to sort of be almost at epidemic proportions, which seems really strange to me.
It seems peculiar, doesn't it? As we all know, that we are living longer, we're living healthier, older lives. I say older in the loosest possible sense. And so, why should there be this terror of aging? And I look back on myself in my 20s and compare it to the me of my late 40s and think, God, I knew nothing then. And I had no confidence. And that's, I think, an interesting perspective, is that those young women that are modifying their faces so early and having some really quite drastic procedures which just aren't necessary, may well look back on the photos of themselves in their 20s and think, what was I doing to my face? At least I only have to look at the slightly dodgy blue sparkly eyeshadow of the 1980s to think, what was I doing to my face?
Or the perms. We all got the perms.
Oh yes, we all had the perms.
One of the things I've been trying to do during the course of the campaign is to engage with broadcasters, which I have found difficult. I have managed to talk to Channel 4 and had a couple of meetings with Channel 4. But I'm finding other broadcasters are a lot more resistant to engaging with it, and yet so incredibly good about representation and meeting with other, rightly concerned groups. But for some reason, again, ageism, especially gendered ageism, doesn't seem to feature very highly in their list of priorities. I just wondered what your feeling would be about that, and whether there was anything you could offer in terms of engaging with broadcasters.
So I think it's a really important point, and broadcasters, we know, when it comes to certainly news broadcasts, desperate to get women onto their programs, and not difficult about the age of women. Yet when it comes to wider broadcast, we all look at our screens, we can see there is a problem. The thing that I would always point out is, look, we need diversity. We absolutely need diversity. So the broadcasters are great at engaging over ethnicity, great about engaging with regard to making sure there is female representation, really bad about age. And I would argue also quite bad about disability. And I think there is an awful lot more needs to be done. I'm always very keen to stress, I am not chair of the Women's Committee. I'm chair of the Women and Equalities Committee. So we have to look at all protected characteristics. And I'm perennially to be found banging the desk and saying, age is a protected characteristic. And absolutely crucially important that employers, and the broadcasters are big employers, understand that. I wish I could say that I was surprised that it was only Channel 4 that had engaged. Sadly, I'm not. And I think Channel 4 have been great about engaging on a whole wide range of issues, and full credit to them and their commitment as a broadcaster. But we need the main stations, the BBCs and the ITVs and Sky, to pick up on this as well, and to be prepared to run with a ball and to champion diversity in all its forms.
One of the things that I often think about is how post Me Too and Time's Up, the entertainment industry as a whole does seem to have made vital changes, especially for younger women. And again, in terms of representation, this does seem to be happening. But again, it's for women under the age of 45. I don't think that, as you quite rightly say, the issue of diversity in terms of age is being addressed in the right way across the industry as a whole. And whilst we're seeing a lot of good stuff coming out of the US in terms of female representation, female-led programming, either on the streaming services or, lesser so, but admittedly in film, I just wondered what you feel you might be able to offer me as a campaigner who is banging her head against the wall. I'm very lucky to have had the endorsement of equity in the last week. But what you could offer just in terms of putting this issue of diversity, which is overlooked, on the agenda.
So I think the important thing that I have to stress is that I can't promise up anything from my committee, because we set an agenda collectively and we haven't discussed age yet. Now, I think that's understandable. We've spent a year discussing COVID and are only really now looking forward to what our programme is post-COVID. Of course, I have a voice and I'm very happy to go and talk to DDCMS and say, can we look at this? What can you do? What more can you do as a government department, as individual ministers, to highlight this, that within the entertainment industry, in its wider sense, there remains a significant problem with gendered ageism, that it's just not right, that we aren't seeing the female faces in broadcast, in film, that we should do. And I know that people will be very quick to point to me, the Helen Mirrens and the Dame Maggie Smiths of this world, and look at the brilliant trailblazing work that they've done. But there are so few of them, and count them against the numerous women in their 20s that you see across your television screens, across film screens. Now, I want to see those women in their 20s, don't get me wrong, I absolutely do. But I also want there to be a range of ages. I want there to be much more diversity around ethnicity, around disability. And we really have to make sure that we're championing, I was about to say Britain as it is, and I don't mean that, the world as it is, and that we see reflected back at us the reality of life today. Now, of course, I understand that broadcast in many ways is fantasy. It's not life today. But you have so many gritty, realistic dramas where women over 50 have just been airbrushed out.
Thank you. And thank you too for being a signatory to my supporters list. So I was able to add your name and brilliantly Caroline Dinage. The Women's Equality Party as a whole have endorsed the campaign, and some great Labour MPs like Jess Phillips and Dawn Butler and Tracy Brabin have also added their name. I'm also delighted that a number of men have added their name. So perhaps what I need to do is to try and contact number 10 and see if I can get the Prime Minister's name on our list of supporters. That might be my way forward.
You know, your biggest ally inside government will be Caroline Dinage, no doubt about it. She's the culture minister, and she is amazing. I say that, she's also my best friend in Parliament, so you know you'd expect me to say that. But tell Caroline that she has to persuade the Prime Minister he needs to sign up, and he's signed up to all sorts of campaigns promoting women, the 50-50 Parliament. So I think we could we could gently encourage the PM to throw his support behind the campaign.
Brilliant.